Major funding for Marcia Adams' Heartland Cooking is provided by Marilot Industries, America's cabinet maker committed to quality in a variety of kitchen and bath cabinetry styles. By Maple Leaf Farms, a symbol for ducklings and frozen entrees, chef quality you can count on. By Souder Woodworking, producers of ready-to-assemble furniture for the home and office, America's furniture craftsmen with more than a half-century of experience.
What would life be without cookies? There probably isn't a single individual who doesn't have memories of a favorite cookie eaten in their grandmother's or their mother's kitchen. Cookies fall into the classification of what I call comfort food. It's hard to imagine anything more satisfying than a handful of cookies and a glass of cold milk. We call those dunkers in the Midwest. But cookies can also be elegant and served as a dessert at a very nice dinner party. We're going to do a combination of both. And I would call them family cookies, and I would also call them entertaining cookies. Two kinds, you see. And I'll give you hints about making the perfect cookie along the way. That's a pretty big promise, but I'll do my best. The very first cookie we're going to make today is called an English toffee cookie. And it's one that you'd want to serve at a party. And I want to make it very quickly so it can bake while we're finishing up the rest of the cookies on the set. In this mixer bowl is 1 cup of butter and 1 cup of brown sugar and 1 teaspoon of salt. And it's been creamed for 3 minutes. And to that, we're going to add 1 beaten egg yolk. It's really a very quick cookie, as you're going to see. And then 2 cups, I'm going to give that just a little quick whirl, and 2 cups of all-purpose flour and a teaspoon of vanilla. Not many ingredients, I'll go over them for you. A cup of butter, a cup of brown sugar, teaspoon of salt, a beaten egg yolk, 2 cups of all-purpose flour, and a teaspoon of vanilla. And I'll mix this together. I have very fond memories of these cookies, and I'll tell you why. My friends gave a baby shower for me when I was pregnant for my son, and that was the first time I ever ate these cookies. And so they've always had pleasant memories. In my own mind, I call them Gerard's baby bridal shower. No, baby cookies? I don't have that right. Well, you know what I mean. Anyway, the original recipe came from the Detroit Free Press, and it's a real treasure. Now, this is the secret of these cookies. You need a 12 by 17 inch pan, and it should be ungreased. And you want then to scrape this out onto this ungreased 12 by 17 inch pan and pat it out. Now, this is going to take some time, so we're going to just sort of give you a quick demo of how you'd begin it so you can see. There, not quite so noisy. We're having all sorts of sound effects we didn't expect. All right, let's see. I have one finished for you because this is going to take a little bit of time, as you can see. And this is what it looks like when it's all finished, ready to go in the oven. Now, you bake this at 350 degrees on the lowest shelf of the oven from anywhere from 15 to 20 minutes. Mind you, that lowest shelf is very, very important. Now, just to make sure that this is done in 20 minutes, I'm not going to set 1 timer, I'm going to set 2. That's sort of obsessive compulsive, but I just don't want any mistakes at this point. We'll finish these up later. Now, the next recipe has a little bit of Indiana history associated with it. I want you to come with me to Indianapolis, Indiana during the mid-1800s. Poet James Whitcomb Riley was one of the most observant interpreters of the life of Middle America during the last century. The domestic and placid family life of that era, the mid-1800s, was the epitome of all that we think of as typical and truly American. No wonder we look at it with a certain amount of nostalgic yearning. The James Whitcomb Riley Memorial is on Lockerbie Square in Indianapolis, Indiana, just a few blocks from the very center of the bustling downtown. Riley's house And this room where I'm having tea is a fine example of Victorian preservation, one of the best across the country. His poetry, mostly written in dialect, is still as popular today with children as it was in the 1900s. Who doesn't know Little Orphan Annie, the Raggedy Man, When the Frost is on the Punkin and the Corn is in the Shock? It was written in this very house in the 1900s. He was a poet nearly from the beginning of his life. His mother wrote verses, and he was encouraged too by his attorney father, as well as Longfellow, to keep writing.
Little orphan Annies come to our house to stay, and wash the cups and saucers up, and brush the crumbs away, and shoo the chickens off the porch, and dust the hearth and sweep, make the fire and bake the bread, and earn her board and keep. And all us other children, when the supper is done.
Here in his bedroom, you can see his beaver hat on the bed. Notice the marble sink in the corner. That was typical in upper middle class houses in the very late 19th century. Riley enjoyed looking well. Actually, he was very dapper, and he lived comfortably too. One of the portraits you'll find in the bedroom is this oil painting of his poodle, Lockerbie. The dining room in the Riley house is very formal in feeling, but at the same time it has a lot of warmth and intimacy, probably because of the red that's used in the decor. The dining room table to me is just stunning. This china pattern is called Paris ware, and of course came from France. This is called a Victorian platform, and it was used to give a centerpiece added importance. But one thing that I found simply charming were these orange cups. And they even have little prongs inside to hold the orange halves. Oranges were quite special in those days, and so they had their very own special silver cup. Notice how this is tipped on the side by design so that the orange is sort of on an angle. Much of the kitchen looks like it did when Riley lived here. He observed family life as it centered around the house and kitchen, and foods are mentioned often in his poems. Little Orphan Annie actually existed. She was a 14-year-old hired girl for the Riley household. Riley died in 1916, but his residence here on Lockerbie Square is open to the public. And on his birthday, every October 7th, snickerdoodle cookies, similar to his favorite sugar cookie, are served to everyone who visits the house. Well, you can guess what kind of cookie I'm going to make, can't you? Snickerdoodles. This cookie is well known in the Midwest, and it's a version of the sugar cookie, and it has cinnamon and sugar rolled about it. You begin by creaming together 1 cup of margarine and 1 1/2 cups of sugar, and you do that for 2 minutes. And then to that, we're going to add 2 eggs and beat those in well. And incidentally, we have a very good 4-H program here in the Midwest, and snickerdoodles is one of the required cookies that 4-Hers are supposed to make. So that may be another reason snickerdoodles are a very popular cookie in the Midwest. I'll beat that in. And in this pitcher is 2 3/4 cup of flour. And in that, I'm going to pour 2 teaspoons of cream of tartar, 1 teaspoon of baking soda, and 1/2 teaspoon of salt. And then just whisk that in together. This just sort of pre-mixes it. Today's flours are all pre-sifted, so you really don't have to sift them. But you'll have a quicker, more quickly combined product if you mix them up a little bit ahead of time, like this. And then we're going to just add this. Whoops. It was such a pleasure reading Riley's poetry all over again. I'd forgotten how charming it was. I grew up with it. My parents read aloud to me as a child, and then later with my own children, I read aloud. Now, this is pretty well beaten up. Combine it well, about a minute, I would say. Now, this dough, you want to refrigerate overnight. And then the next day, form your cookies. And this is what the dough looks like when it's all ready to go. See, it's quite firm now. You're going to be able to roll these. Now you want to break off pieces that are what we call marble-sized. Actually, I think we'd call these Aggie-sized. And if you could get this kind of a marble, if you were playing with the kids out in the schoolyard, you were a pretty sharp marble player. And then you roll these Aggie-sized snickerdoodle balls in a mixture of 1/4 cup of granulated sugar and 4 teaspoons of cinnamon. As I mentioned to you before, using butter as a shortening gives you a crisp cookie, and vegetable shortening yields a softer cookie. And also adding corn oil that gives you the softest cookie of all. And if you ever use corn oil in any, or corn, even corn margarine, you're going to have to chill your cookie at least 5 hours or overnight before you can roll it out. Never use the soft style or diet margarine in any of your cookies. So they contain less fat and more water, and you just won't have a satisfactory cookie at all. See how quick this is? Kids like making these too. I can see why it's a good 4-H project. This particular cookie is crisp, actually, because of its high amount of sugar, because as you notice, I did use margarine. This recipe has always called for margarine. Now you bake these at 400 degrees, 6 to 8 minutes on the middle shelf of your oven. That's also another good cookie hint. Unless you're otherwise told in a recipe or by me, bake in the middle oven. So let's go over and take a look at snickerdoodles when they're finished. This is what they look like. Wonderfully crackly on top and very buttery and sweet, of course. And it's kind of fun to read them with, to eat them when you're reading maybe some poems by James Whitcomb Riley. The next cookie is one of the most unusual ones I've ever eaten, and I think it's absolutely delicious. It's called a basil orange cookie, and believe it or not, it has 1/4 cup of dried basil as the flavoring. And you begin, again as you do most cookies, by creaming together 1 1/2 cups of sugar and 1 1/2 cups of vegetable shortening for 3 minutes. And then to that, we're going to add 2 eggs. Now, this recipe came to me from a woman by the name of Oris Hippensteel, who has a wonderful herb garden and also teaches herb classes, and at a pre-Civil War farmhouse that is surrounded by 200 varieties of herbs. And this is one of the cookies that she serves at her herb classes. Now, basil orange cookies. I'll blend this. Now the dry ingredients are 5 cups of all-purpose flour, and then to that we're going to add 2 teaspoons of soda and a teaspoon of salt. Let me review what we've done for you so far. We have 1.5 cups of granulated sugar and 1 1/2 cup of vegetable shortening this time. 5 cups of flour, 2 teaspoons of soda, and a teaspoon of salt. And then we're going to add this to the creamed mixture. This is probably going to fly all over again. These cookies, because you're using dried basil, taste better. Oh, and incidentally, don't forget I added 2 eggs there to that sugar butter mixture. I always forget that. And what was I saying about basil? Ah, yes, you must use the dried basil in this, not the fresh. These cookies taste better as they ripen, so they'll be better on the 2nd or 3rd day, I think. Though, of course, they're quite irresistible at first. And then, to this, we add 2/3 cup of orange juice. And 3 tablespoons of orange rind. And a teaspoon of vanilla. I have a question here from the girls on the staff. There is a cup of milk on this tray. Does this mean this recipe has a cup of milk in it, or do we have this confused with another recipe? I have this confused with another recipe. And then, it does have a cup of milk in it? Okay. My, I'm glad we caught that. I would have had 1,000 letters, let me tell you. This is what's so great about cookies. You know, you really don't have to be too precise. That's pretty obvious, isn't it? There we are. Oh, what a mess. Okay. Now then, we're going to add the secret ingredient, which isn't a secret, but it's certainly the secret of a good cookie, 1/4 cup of dried basil. And in it goes. These cookies are really very cake-like and lovely when they're finished. They freeze well. And then you drop them onto a cookie sheet by heaping teaspoons. And you notice that we're using parchment paper here on practically every cookie. This is just a great item. And make them quite far apart because they're going to spread. As I mentioned to you, they're going to look like little cakes when they're all finished. Then this is what they look like when they're baked. And you want to bake these for 8 to 10 minutes at 350 degrees. Now the frosting is also perfectly delicious, and it's just a simple confectioner's frosting with a little bit of orange extract in it. And you want it to be a rather firm frosting, because I'll show you what I'm going to do with it. You want to sort of have it thick, and so you can smear it on in dollops, like that. And then you're going to put it upside down on ground pistachio nuts and roll it back and forth. And there we have the basil orange cookie. There are many kinds of basil, and I have some fresh ones over here to show you. This is the more conventional kind. This is just a baby, but this will get to be a very large bush and makes a wonderful pesto, for instance. And these are the globe basil and the globe cinnamon basil. And it's very, very pretty. The very next recipe we're going to do is called the Almond Joy cookie, and it's from a Minnesota Lutheran cookbook, and it gets its name because it tastes very much like that wonderful candy bar. And in the double boiler, over hot water for 5 to 7 minutes, I have been cooking 1 can of sweetened condensed milk. And sweet condensed milk is just exactly what it says. Look how thick this is. That's because it is, number 1, condensed, and it has a very high content of sugar. And 2 squares of bitter chocolate. These are all melted together, ready to go. And we're going to pour this over 3 cups of sweetened flaked coconut. Doesn't this sound delicious? It's really more of a confection rather than a cookie, but it looks very nice on a cookie tray. And I know you're going to want to try it, and you see how easy it is. It would be a very good recipe for you to do with your children sometime. I think it's wonderful to start teaching your kids how to cook early, and cookies are one way to do it because they adore them, and they'll work to make cookies. So here we're going to add just a little bit of vanilla, maybe a teaspoon, and a speck of salt. And I wonder how much time left I've got on those cookies. I had to move this down here on my waist because it was hitting my mic. Oh, piece of cake, piece of cookie. We're in good shape on those other cookies. All right, here we are mixing this up. Doesn't this look great? There. Actually, I am making a cookie, as you can see, without flour. But I do want to discuss cookies and flours with you while I am mixing this up. I think that using bleached white flour makes a much better cookie. Save that unbleached flour for your bread baking or your old-fashioned pie crust. Unbleached flour has a very high protein content, which is great for making bread, but it makes a cookie tough. We do not want any tough cookies in our kitchens. So if you want a chewy cookie, go right ahead and use the unbleached flour. And actually, that unbleached flour could be used in a chewy cookie, say like the old-fashioned oatmeal cookies with lots of raisins. But I prefer tender cookies, so I use the bleached flour. Now we're ready to drop these out on a cookie sheet, again using the parchment paper. And do this by teaspoons. This is pretty good, just at this point, even without baking it, as you might guess. And there's one blob. And this is, you can use your fingers, and that's part of the fun that kids have in making cookies, I think, and probably adults too. It's a very permissible way to be messy. There isn't much in life that kids get to do that's messy, that's fun. And then you top them, you see, with the almond, hence its name, Almond Joy, and it really does taste like that. And then these are to be baked at 350 degrees for 10 to 12 minutes. But I want you to start looking at them from about 8 to 9 minutes because they do get very brown on the bottom. Let's take a look at them over here and see what you think. Aren't these just great? And they really are a winner of a cookie, I would say. Well, let's check the toffee bars. I think we could bring them out and finish them up. This aside here. This is one of those cases where you pray you really had turned on the oven. Ooh, they look good. They look good. There. Now, what you do next, and this is the fun part, is it's 9 Hershey bars, 9 chocolate bars, use any kind you like, and line them up. I leave them in little pieces of these thirds. I think I said 9 bars. The recipe called for 8. I rather think I use 9 because I tend to be excessive with this kind of thing. Now what you want to do is line them up rather closely, and I have to do this. It's sort of like playing cards or solitaire, you know, red on black, black on red. There, queen on the king. But you do this because you need to give this business a chance to melt while you're doing it. And the closer you get them together, the easier it is to spread this out. Now, these actually are better if you keep them either in the refrigerator or if you store them in the freezer. And if you leave them out at room temperature, the cookie batter is apt to absorb the moisture from the chocolate and they get soggy. You really want a nice crisp cookie. Now, see how this is melted and it's ready to go? Oh, perfect, see? Now this is a very easy way to frost these cookies. It's doing just what it's supposed to do. I was talking to you earlier about James Whitcomb Riley. He was just one of many Indiana authors during that period. Indiana had a reputation of being a state that produced a lot of writers during the late 1800s and early 1900s, and that include Booth Tarkington and Russ Lockridge, who wrote Raintree County. We'll be hearing more about that later on. Gene Stratton Porter, who wrote The Girl of the Limberlost and Freckles, Cornelia Otis Skinner, Ernie Pyle, and of course a contemporary author today that you all have heard of, I know, is Kurt Vonnegut, who was originally from Indianapolis, as was Riley, and wrote a great deal about Indianapolis. Some of it was flattering and some of it was, you know, but at any rate, that's the luxury of being a writer. Now, you're going to have to use your imagination on the rest of this. I think we're ahead of schedule. All right, there. Now, although this is what you do, after this is all melted down, then you want to take a mixture of 1 cup, isn't it? Yes, of finely chopped pecans and 1 1/2 teaspoon of vegetable oil and a bit of salt that has been baked together at 350 degrees for 5 to 7 minutes. And that can be done ahead of time, a couple days ahead of time. Put it on like this, you see? And then what you're going to do is take your fingers and pat that on firmly. Your mouth is watering, isn't it? So is mine. We're going to have a whole crowd in here after the show is over. And that's the way that whole thing is going to be when it is finished. Now, let's review what we did today. The English toffee cookies, which look like this when they're all completed. And they resemble in flavor the candy of the same name. Keep them on hand in your freezer if you're strong-willed enough. The delicious snickerdoodle, a favorite requirement of 4-H organizations across the Midwest and a favorite requirement in lots of people's kitchens. And of course, the Almond Joy cookie. It came from a Minnesota Lutheran Church cookbook. And lastly, the orange basil cookie, a soft, cake-like, herb-infused cookie, most unusual. I have the most fascinating flour sifter to show you today. Of course, it was made by hand, and it's an antique. Look at this. The cylinder inside has these paddles that move back and forth. You would put the flour in, sift it, and then you would turn it over and re-sift again. This is an antique lemon squeezer. I could have used it for the orange juice today in the orange basil cookies, putting the orange half in here and squeezing it down. These are old antique cookie cutters, very primitive looking, and look at the shapes. They're not at all commercial looking. Isn't this terrific? Right here we have a Santa Claus, a heart that doesn't look like anybody else's heart. Most of these were made by men during the winter with scrap metal. And this man here was obviously a fisherman. And this too, here's another fish cookie. Fish cookies are really rather unusual. And here we have a Flo blue plate. This would have been the kind of plate that the Riley household would have had in their kitchen and probably would have served their snickerdoodles on them. The word flow comes from the process of firing. The blue flowed during the firing. Incidentally, this is one of my favorite patterns. So this particular quilt that's used as a backdrop today was called Grandmother's Garden. Isn't it pretty? So until next time, as a goot, eat good.
Major funding for Marcia Adams Heartland Cooking is provided by Marcia Industries, America's cabinet maker, committed to quality in a variety of kitchen and bath cabinetry styles. By Maple Leaf Farms, a symbol for ducklings and frozen entrees, chef quality you can count on. By Souder Woodworking, America's furniture craftsman with more than 50 years' experience, Sauder provides ready-to-assemble furniture for today's home and office.